When Sophie rose with tears glistening in her eyes, the entire room froze. Her words would shatter decades of quiet loyalties and ignite a revolution at the very heart of the monarchy. The grand hall at Windsor, usually a fortress of order and dignity, was now thick with unease. The family had gathered for what was meant to be a solemn dinner, just another night of ritual and restraint. But as Sophie slowly stood, clutching her glass, her movements deliberate and trembling, the faint sound of silver against crystal came to an abrupt halt. The scrape of chairs, the clink of forks, the polite murmur of conversation all vanished into a chilling silence that wrapped itself around the room like a storm cloud waiting to break. Every eye fell on her. At the head of the table, King Charles' brow furrowed ever so slightly, though his hands remained rigidly in place. William and Catherine, seated across from each other, exchanged brief, tense glances. There had been whispers for weeks of strained meetings, icy corridors, and an unspoken battle for the soul of the crown. But no one expected it to surface here, in this room, under the full gaze of the entire royal family. Sophie's face was pale yet resolute, her lips pressed tightly together, as if holding back a flood of words that had been threatening to spill for far too long. The Queen's absence hung over them all like a ghost. Though her physical presence had long since faded, her influence remained a heavy weight, pressing down on every choice, every conversation. And tonight, that weight felt unbearable. The dinner had already been marked by subtle barbs and curt remarks. William, usually stoic, had grown visibly agitated at Charles' thinly veiled criticisms about modernizing too quickly. Catherine, though graceful as ever, avoided her father-in-law's gaze entirely, staring down at her plate as though it held the answers to questions no one dared to ask. Even Anne, typically unwavering in her composure, appeared unsettled, fidgeting with the delicate chain around her neck. But now, with Sophie rising, all pretense fell away. The air shifted. Her chest heaved with quiet determination as she clutched the stem of her glass, her knuckles white. Around the table, worried glances flickered between family members, each silently asking the same question: what is she about to say? The tension was palpable, electric, as though everyone already knew that this moment this woman would change everything. And then, Sophie's voice, both soft and defiant, broke through the silence. Her tearful confession would rip open a wound no one was ready to face. Her voice cracked as she uttered the forbidden phrase, "The crown must change hands." Gasps, murmurs, and fury erupted as the implications sank in. Sophie's words did not merely hang in the air, they pierced it, cutting through the fragile veneer of decorum like a blade. She stood taller now, her shoulders squared despite the tears streaking down her face, as though the very weight of what she carried had been lifted simply by speaking it aloud. Every pair of eyes, sharp, wide, and unblinking, was locked on her. No one moved, no one dared. Sophie drew in a breath that seemed to echo off the walls and, with an almost pained resolve, continued. Her voice quivered at first, then hardened as she declared without hesitation that King Charles' reign was faltering. She spoke of the whispers that had become shouts behind closed doors, of the growing despair among courtiers and confidants alike, who feared the monarchy was losing its grip on the people. Her gaze swept the room deliberately, as though daring anyone to deny it. Silence answered her. And then, with a devastating calm, she acknowledged what no one had dared say to his face. His health had become a specter over the crown. Sophie spoke not just of his physical decline, but of his emotional fragility and unraveling that she claimed she had witnessed firsthand. The room shifted uncomfortably at her words, the murmurs returning in hushed, frantic waves. To speak so plainly of the king's weaknesses was nothing short of treason, yet she pressed on. Her voice softened, but her words gained weight as she revealed private conversations she had shared with William and Catherine, talks where they spoke of the future, not in hope, but in obligation. She claimed they were ready, more ready than they had let on, carrying within them a vision that could rescue the monarchy from the shadows where it now lingered. But all the while, she said, Charles clung to the throne with an iron grip, refusing to see the danger his pride had brought upon them all. Sophie's tears fell more freely now, but they did not weaken her resolve. Instead, they sharpened it, and she turned to Charles directly, her voice breaking only to harden again. "I am sorry," she told him, "but the truth cannot remain buried under tradition any longer." The words rang out like a sentence, final and irrevocable. As she bowed her head slightly, in a gesture of respect that barely masked her defiance. Charles remained still. He said nothing. Yet the narrowness of his eyes betrayed a tempest behind them, his lips pressing into a line so thin it almost vanished. Rage, humiliation, and disbelief seemed to war for dominance in his expression, but he offered no reply. But as her words hung in the air like a dagger, Catherine's sudden reaction would only deepen the royal rift. Before anyone could respond, Catherine rose, her hands trembling yet her eyes fierce. Was she about to support Sophie or defend the king? The tension, already suffocating, sharpened into something almost unbearable as all eyes shifted from Sophie to Catherine. For a fleeting moment, even Sophie seemed unsure whether the woman beside her was an ally or a challenger. Catherine's gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on Charles before locking onto Sophie with a quiet intensity that silenced every remaining murmur in the hall. Then, in one bold movement, she walked deliberately to Sophie's side. There was no hesitation, only resolve. Her voice, low but unwavering, cut through the heavy silence like a bell. She acknowledged Sophie's courage and her audacity to speak what so many feared to admit. The monarchy, she declared, her tone laced with both defiance and sorrow, must reflect the future, not the past. Every syllable carried weight. Each word, a challenge to the old order and a promise of something new. William stiffened where he sat, his jaw tightening as he watched his wife take her stand. He appeared torn, his loyalty split between the father who had raised him and the woman who now embodied everything the future demanded. His expression betrayed the battle raging within him, a battle between the duty drilled into him since childhood and the raw, undeniable truth playing out before his eyes. Around the table, Anne's disapproval was immediate and piercing. Her lips tightened into a thin line, and her arms crossed defensively, as though shielding herself from the shift in power she could feel swelling in the room. Andrew scoffed audibly, shaking his head and muttering under his breath, but even he did not rise to counter Catherine's words outright. The old guard looked suddenly small, diminished under the weight of Catherine's quiet authority. The tension escalated as the two women, one by marriage, the other by blood, and choice stood united against centuries of tradition and fear. Together, they radiated not just rebellion, but inevitability. The air in the room seemed to thrum with the realization that history was no longer something being written by the men seated at the table, it was being claimed by the women standing before them. And yet, beneath Catherine's fierce composure, there was an edge to her words, a darkness hinting at secrets still buried. She spoke of a monarchy in need of healing, but her pointed glance toward Charles carried an unspoken accusation, a suggestion that his private failings went far deeper than anyone dared name aloud. But it was William's next unexpected and explosive move that would send shockwaves beyond the palace walls. Finally, after years of silent restraint, William's voice boomed across the hall, echoing with both pain and determination. "It's time to end this charade." The words crashed into the silence like a thunderclap, silencing every whisper, freezing every movement. For so long, he had held back, swallowing his frustrations behind the polite mask demanded of a future king. But as he rose to his full height, the air in the room thickened with the force of everything he had bottled up for decades, now pouring out in a single, devastating wave. He fixed his father with a steady, unflinching gaze, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared. And then, without waiting for permission, he began to speak, his voice both measured and fierce, each word a deliberate blow. He listed, one by one, the instances where Charles' leadership had, in his words, damaged the family and the realm. He spoke of decisions made not out of love for the people, but out of fear, of stubborn pride that had left the monarchy vulnerable to scandal and irrelevance. Each accusation was met with sharp intakes of breath and widened eyes, but William pressed on, unshaken. The room seemed to shrink as he revealed the private struggles Catherine had endured under the current regime. His tone grew heavier, darker, as he recounted how she had been dismissed, silenced, and undermined, not just by whispers from outsiders, but by those within these very walls. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke of nights she wept in silence, of moments she doubted whether she could carry the impossible weight placed upon her shoulders. These words hung in the air like a knife poised to strike, and this time, even the most loyal among them could not look away. William's fury deepened as he turned to the wider truth that could no longer be ignored, that the people, he said, were no longer willing to endure a monarch who clung to power out of fear of being forgotten. He accused Charles of ignoring the will of the nation, of turning away from the growing cry for a younger, stronger generation to lead them forward. And still, Charles said nothing, his face a mask of cold defiance, though his hands trembled faintly at his sides. Anne could take no more. She shot up from her seat, cutting through the air with her voice as she rushed to her brother's defense, branding William's words cruel, ungrateful, and dangerous. But William, now unyielding, turned on her too, his words clashing with hers in a heated shouting match that cracked through the fragile calm like lightning through glass. Their voices rose higher, overlapping, a tempest of rage and wounded pride, until at last William silenced them all, with one final, thunderous declaration. "I will not let my children inherit this chaos." The words fell like a gavel, final and unarguable, silencing even Anne as she sat down, defeated and seething. Yet as the room descended into chaos, Sophie, still holding her glass, delivered one more revelation that would leave everyone breathless. A trembling Sophie confessed to a secret pact, one that none of them saw coming, and one that would unravel the monarchy's deepest deception. Her voice, barely above a whisper at first, grew steadier as she spoke, every word landing like a hammer on the brittle quiet of the room. She explained that, in the final months of the Queen's life, she and Her Majesty had shared long, private conversations that revealed a hidden plan, a vision for the crown that diverged entirely from what had been publicly assumed. Sophie's revelation stole the breath from every corner of the table. She said the Queen had seen the fractures growing, had seen the institution teetering under the weight of Charles's pride and the public's dwindling patience. And it was during one of those late-night talks, Sophie said, that the Queen entrusted her with what she called a sacred duty to guide the transition quietly but decisively, ensuring William and Catherine would inherit the throne before it was too late. Gasps rippled across the room. Every gaze was now fixed on her, some with disbelief, others with a dawning recognition that something about her story rang frighteningly true. With shaking hands, Sophie reached into her pocket and produced a letter. The sight of it silenced even the most cynical among them. Sealed, bearing the royal insignia, and marked confidential, it appeared untouched by time, yet carried the full weight of everything they feared. Her fingers lingered on it for a long moment before she laid it on the table for all to see. She claimed the letter contained the Queen's own words, written explicitly to affirm William and Catherine as the rightful successors not after Charles' natural passing, but as a deliberate decision to safeguard the monarchy's future. A hush fell as Charles's face darkened, his voice breaking the silence with a sharp accusation. He branded the letter a forgery, a cruel fabrication designed to humiliate him and seize what was rightfully his. But his words faltered when Anne leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the Queen's familiar seal. And slowly, others around the table began murmuring, their doubts about Charles visibly growing. The tension twisted into something more dangerous as alliances began to fracture in real time. For the first time that night, the family was no longer united, not even in pretense. Some leaned toward Charles, unwilling to betray him even now. But others, captivated by Sophie's quiet defiance and the letter's eerie authority, began to drift toward her and Catherine, their loyalty visibly shifting before everyone's eyes. What had begun as whispers had now split the room into factions, each one poised for war. As the Queen's letter was passed around in stunned silence, a deeper, darker truth was about to be exposed, one that would seal Charles' fate forever. It was the revelation no one dared speak aloud. Charles' hidden weakness was finally laid bare, and it would prove impossible to ignore. Sophie's voice was steadier now, sharpened by the weight of what she was about to disclose. The Queen's letter still rested on the table, but her next words carried an even darker force, aimed squarely at the man who still clung to his throne. She began by revealing details of Charles' declining health, something she said the family had suspected but never truly confronted. Behind the polished smiles and meticulously orchestrated public engagements, she claimed, the king had been quietly unraveling. She spoke of late-night calls from worried doctors, whispered conversations with senior palace staff who confessed their unease, and private moments where Charles himself faltered in ways the cameras would never show. Sophie pulled no punches. She cited specific doctor reports she had secretly obtained, reports detailing not just the toll of his physical ailments, but their impact on his ability to lead decisively. Names, dates, and diagnoses tumbled from her lips, each fact striking the table like a gavel, leaving no doubt that her words were not just suspicion, they were evidence. And then came the most damning accusation of all. Sophie suggested that his mental state was no longer fit for kingship. Her voice softened here, but it carried a quiet fury. She spoke of moments she had personally witnessed: confusion in meetings, missed details, erratic outbursts, all carefully concealed behind a facade of regal authority. Every detail painted a portrait of a man fighting not just his critics but himself, locked in a battle he could no longer win. She accused him outright of manipulating his public appearances to project strength, calling them nothing more than a charade carefully managed by handlers and loyal aides. The image of the unshakable monarch, she said, was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, a cruel deception maintained for the sake of pride while the institution crumbled under his feet. Across the table, Catherine and William remained somber, their silence speaking louder than words. Their expressions were unreadable, yet the air between them hummed with tension, as though every accusation Sophie unleashed cut them as deeply as it cut Charles. It was as though they had already known some of what she was saying, but hearing it aloud, in this room, made it undeniable. Charles, however, refused to yield. His voice, low and venomous, cracked through the silence as he denied every claim, branding them lies crafted to humiliate him and tear the family apart. But even as the words fell from his lips, his hands trembled faintly, his eyes darting, unable to meet the gaze of those around him. For the first time that night, he looked visibly shaken, the armor of kingship beginning to crack. But even as the king stood defiant, Catherine delivered a final, devastating statement that shattered his composure once and for all. Her voice cracked but never wavered, as Catherine issued an ultimatum, one that would decide the future of the crown before the night was over. After Sophie's searing revelations and Charles's stubborn denials, the room felt heavy with unresolved truths, and yet Catherine's presence cut through it all like a quiet storm. Slowly, she stepped forward, no longer standing beside Sophie but now facing the king directly. Her words began softly, almost tenderly, but each syllable carried the weight of finality. She pleaded with Charles to abdicate, not as a punishment, but as a way to avoid the further humiliation that was already unfolding around him. It was not just a plea, it was a warning, draped in grace. She spoke of her children, her voice catching slightly when she mentioned them. She painted the picture of what they deserved, a stable monarchy, free of whispered scandals and public doubt, something they could inherit with dignity rather than shame. The mention of her children seemed to ripple through the room, softening even the hardest expressions. Her tone hardened just enough to remind everyone present that her words were not a request but a demand cloaked in compassion. Catherine then promised what few others could have offered, that if Charles chose to step aside quietly, she would honor him publicly. She promised that history would remember him not as a king dethroned by force, but as a father and a statesman who knew when to yield for the greater good. Her words carried a rare generosity, offering him not only a path out but a way to salvage his legacy. Her eyes glimmered with a subtle intensity as she reassured him, telling him that despite everything, he would still be celebrated by the family, or by the nation, as the man who held the monarchy together when it risked falling apart. But she warned that this chance would not last forever. The longer he clung to his throne, the more the cracks would deepen, until there was nothing left to protect. Charles listened in silence, his fists clenched tightly in his lap, as though holding himself together by sheer will, yet his eyes betrayed him. They glistened faintly, the iron mask of his composure beginning to fracture under the weight of her words. Around them, the family watched in breathless stillness, caught between their instinct to defend their king and the undeniable truth pressing in from every corner of the room. Loyalty and reality clashed in their eyes, and no one seemed sure which would win. And then, as the weight of her words sank in, it was Sophie once again who delivered the final blow that ended an era. With a trembling hand and tearful eyes, Sophie raised her glass one last time, delivering words that marked the end of an era and the dawn of a new reign. The room had fallen into a charged silence after Catherine's ultimatum, the weight of it pressing down like a final judgment. But Sophie knew the moment required closure, something no one else seemed brave enough to deliver. Her voice, though quivering with emotion, carried clearly as she stood taller. lifting her glass above the table where the Queen's letter still lay like an unspoken verdict. She began by formally declaring what everyone now understood but few had dared to say aloud, that the family, as fractured and wounded as it was, stood collectively behind William and Catherine. Her words framed it not as rebellion but as survival, not as betrayal but as the inevitable progression of history. She spoke with a grace that softened the edges of the brutal truth she had been forced to deliver all evening. Turning her gaze toward Charles, she offered him respect, even as she made it clear his reign was over. She praised his decades of service, his devotion to duty through years of unimaginable scrutiny and sacrifice. Her words honored the man he had been, but they left no doubt that his time as sovereign had reached its natural end. "The future," she said with quiet finality, "belongs to the young, and we must not stand in its way any longer." Around the table, the silence began to break. Slowly, almost reluctantly. One by one, the other royals, Anne, Andrew, even some of the most steadfast loyalists began to raise their glasses. The movements were hesitant at first, as though their bodies struggled to catch up to what their hearts already knew. But eventually, they all stood, their glasses catching the tension in the room and refracting it into something fragile but undeniable: acceptance. Across the table, William and Catherine locked eyes, the realization dawning between them that the crown was now theirs to bear. The look they shared spoke volumes of relief, fear, and determination all at once. This was no longer just about seizing the throne, it was about carrying the burden of a family, a nation, and a history that would not easily let them go. Charles remained seated. Though his eyes glistened faintly and his jaw tightened with unspoken fury, he held himself with a kind of defeated dignity. The crown, invisible yet crushing, seemed to slip from him at that moment, as if everyone in the room felt it leave his grasp and settle somewhere else entirely. The toast echoed through the room, solemn and resonant, and whispers of change began to ripple beyond the palace walls, reaching places even they could not yet imagine. But just as the final toast settled, one last, shocking twist emerged from the shadows, ensuring the transition would not be without its price. Even as the crown passed, a final revelation sent chills through the room, a warning that this triumph carried a dangerous cost. Just as Sophie lowered her glass and the family seemed to exhale, a voice from the edge of the table broke the fragile quiet. A royal advisor, usually so silent he might have been mistaken for part of the furniture, stepped forward clutching a thick dossier that seemed to hum with menace. The family turned toward him in confusion, but his eyes, dark and unflinching, revealed no hesitation. With a quiet but deliberate tone, he revealed that evidence had surfaced of foreign interference in the very succession they had just orchestrated. The words hung there like a guillotine blade, and an audible gasp ran around the table. According to the advisor, forces outside the palace had influenced decisions in ways none of them had detected. Emails, financial contributions, and covert conversations painted a chilling picture. Someone somewhere had an interest in seeing Charles removed and William crowned. Not out of loyalty to the realm, but out of self-interest. As his words unfolded, the confidence in Catherine and William's faces wavered ever so slightly. A faint shadow of doubt flickered between them as they exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. Had they been pawns all along? The advisor's words sharpened as he claimed that even Sophie, whose courage had driven the night's events, might have been manipulated into forcing the abdication. Whispers swirled around her as she froze in place, her breath catching in her throat. The letter, the pact with the Queen, the carefully timed revelations all began to look less like destiny and more like design. Her hands tightened around her glass, her eyes darting between faces as she tried to comprehend how much of her own role had been her choice and how much had been played for her. From his seat, Charles finally spoke, not with rage this time, but with a quiet, ominous calm that unsettled everyone more than his fury ever could. He warned them of unseen forces that would not tolerate this transition, forces he claimed had been circling the monarchy for years, waiting for just such a moment of vulnerability. His voice carried no threat, only certainty, and it sent a shiver through the air. The family sat in stunned silence, realization dawning like a bitter dawn that they may have underestimated the true stakes of the crown. What had seemed like a victory moments ago now felt like walking straight into an unseen war, one they might not yet understand and certainly could not control. And as the advisor placed the dossier on the table and stepped back, the room seemed to darken with unspoken questions, uneasy alliances, and the faint scent of betrayal still clinging to the air. As the royal family braces for the storm ahead, one thing is certain: the crown has changed hands, but peace is far from guaranteed. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.